This is Chapter 9, Sections 2 and 3. Section 2 is the Market Revolution, and Section 3 is New Social Classes and Cultures. So, the Market Revolution. At this time, we have a lot of migration to the Southwest and the Midwest, and it leads to a market revolution, just changes in the market. If you remember, in the late 1700s to early 1800s, there was a movement to improve the infrastructure east of the Appalachian Mountains. Also keep in mind that Americans continued to move westward as the U.S. expanded and more states were added to the U.S. So, as more products were being produced, merchants worked to get them to consumers in faster and cheaper ways. So in the mid-1800s, there's a movement to continue to connect the Atlantic states, the eastern states, with one another, and to connect them also to the West. And so they want to start to improve the infrastructure, the transportation, and the communication of all of the U.S. and not just those eastern states. So people started to appeal to the government to make internal improvements. So the transportation revolution forges regional ties. There were many different ways that they improved upon the transportation of goods. One of those was through creating turnpikes or toll roads, which we've talked about before. One major turnpike that was built at this time was called the National Road. It was an interstate highway, which means that it connected different states. And the purpose was to connect the Midwest with the Atlantic coast. So it extended from Maryland to Illinois. It was supposed to extend all the way through Missouri, but they ran out of funding, so it ended in Illinois. Another thing they did to improve the infrastructure was create canals. The Erie Canal is an example of this. It's a major canal in New York. It expands or spans over 360 miles. And it connected Lake Erie, which is one of the Great Lakes, to the Hudson River. And it was a major engineering feat. It's the longest canal of its time. The longest one before this was only 30 miles. So to go from 30 miles to 360 miles took a lot of work and a lot of effort. It's a huge feat. Steamboats were also an improvement on transportation. Robert Fulton built the first steamboat in 1803, but it was unable to navigate the shallow rivers in the U.S. And so steamboats were improved upon in the 1820s, and it helped to cut travel time and costs for transporting people and goods. And so they're used to travel all the canals that were being built. Railroads were really important. The 1850s is known as the age of the railroads. And they began to replace canals as the most efficient form of travel. So the federal and state governments subsidized, which means they paid for, many of these internal improvements, which actually means that the taxpayers were paying for these improvements. Now, most of these improvements were happening in the North. We'll talk about this later, but the Southerners are not going to support internal improvements. They have rivers that they can use to navigate, and they don't want to have to pay these taxes for these internal improvements that they don't need when they can just use their river system. And once again, that's another thing that's going to contribute to growing tension between the North and the South is the idea of financing these internal improvements. All right, the growth of cities and towns, manufacturing and transportation centers grew quickly, and with that growth came jobs. And so cities started to grow a great deal during this time. People were coming from other countries moving into the cities. People were coming from the farms and the West moving into these cities looking for jobs. And so you see a ton of growth in the cities and towns. So, because of this market revolution, we get new social classes and cultures. First is the business elite. They're a very small class, but they're very wealthy, and they controlled a large percent of the nation's wealth. They included merchants, landlords, manufacturers, and bankers. And they have the nice possessions. They have the nice clothes, the really nice homes and carriages. They have servants that worked in their homes. And they kept themselves isolated both socially and residentially from the lower class. They don't associate with those of the lower classes. And they typically lived on the outskirts of the city. They have the means and the money to travel into the city for work, so they don't have to live in the city. The middle class was a growing class at the time. These were people like business owners, professionals like doctors and lawyers, and contractors. Husbands made enough money so their wives in the middle class did not have to work. And they had material comfort. They weren't as wealthy as the business elite, but they had a comfortable life. Production was more efficient, so goods were less expensive, and so the middle class could afford to have the nice things for their family, nice clothes and furniture, carriages. They even had enough money to buy these new appliances like furnaces and ice boxes. The wives and daughters were literate in the middle class. The middle class also sent their children to high school. Morality and discipline was stressed to the children. And they idealized the self-made man, someone who works hard and saves his money and is successful because of his own work. Social mobility was a very important idea at this time for the middle class. They always wanted to be part of the elite, and so they valued the idea that you could be a self-made man, bring yourselves up from rags to riches. The new urban poor. These people, the poor, did not have job security, and they often worked only short-term jobs, meaning like construction, and when the construction of a building was done, they were out of work again. They had to look for another construction job. Constructing houses or factories or even canals or roads or railroads, any of that type of work was only short term. And if times got tough, they were the first to be laid off. They were typically unskilled workers, uneducated, and paid very little, barely enough even for rent and food. They had very few material possessions. They couldn't afford it, even with the lower prices. The children often have to work, and they struggled to survive. And they lived in overcrowded, run-down, unclean conditions in the insides of the city. This is a quote from a New York legislature that describes one of the slum areas in New York City. It says, "Hideous squalor and deadly effluvia, the dim, undrained courts oozing with pollution, the dark, narrow stairways decayed with age, reeking with filth, overrun with vermin." And that's the type of conditions the urban poor were living in. So this kind of leads us to the benevolent empire. Wealthy Americans started to believe that it was their job to help the poor Americans and bring not just help to them, but bring moral discipline to them. So they started to target social evils like drinking. And so we got a temperance movement, which meant like they wanted to ban alcohol. They targeted prostitution, adultery, and crime. Now, the traditional ways of addressing these issues was through sermons and advice. But during the benevolent empire, there were new methods that were being used. They started banning activities like carnivals of drinking and dancing. They established refuge homes and insane asylums to help those in need and control the threats to society. They started moral rehabilitation for criminals and an end to physical punishment. They boycotted businesses that ran on Sundays, respect the Sabbath. And they campaigned for blue laws to prevent certain activities on Sundays. A blue law is a law that would prohibit drinking or games or festivals or businesses on the Lord's Day, on Sunday. So this leads to revivalism and reform. If you remember the Second Great Awakening, it was another Protestant religious revival started in the 1790s, and it promised universal salvation where everyone could be saved. It called Americans to spiritual conversions, but also to change their bad habits. And so the wealthy were called to be humbled, drinkers were called to clean up, and a good work ethic was stressed. And so this is, all still ongoing during this time. All right, immigration and cultural conflict is the last section. Between 1840 and 1860, millions of Irish, British, and German immigrants came to the U.S. These were immigrants from northwestern areas of Europe. And they moved to the northern cities for jobs. They tended to avoid the South. Slaves had the jobs that they could do in the South, so they wouldn't find any work there. So they mostly settled in the North. The poorest of these immigrants were the Irish. They were fleeing the potato famine at the time, and so they came here looking for any type of job they could find, as low paying as it was. So they took the low paying jobs and they lived in tenement housing or those overcrowded apartments. But their influence here caused the Catholic Church to grow in the U.S. It was because of the Irish immigrations at this time that the Catholic Church began to grow. But there was a lot of fear and dislike for Irish immigrants, and it continued to grow among the native-born Americans. Part of this came from the Protestant enthusiasm of the Second Great Awakening. It was, they were anti-Catholic. They were very heavily Protestant. Others, especially the unions, felt that the Irish were taking jobs from the Americans and were driving wages down because they were willing to work for less, and so they didn't like the Irish for that. And so we start to see a wave of nativism, which means protecting the interest of native-born citizens. So we see this wave of nativism sweeping across America. It's very, you see a lot of anti-Irish publications. You see calls for limits on immigration. There's a lot of restrictions placed on public offices. Public offices were only for native-born citizens. If you were born somewhere else, you couldn't hold that office. And you'll also see the promotion of Protestant faith in schools. And all of this did actually stir up some violence. There was a lot of anti-Catholic riots that broke out because of this wave of nativism and the Irish being in opposition to the Protestant church. So that's what the cities basically looked like around the mid-1800s, and the influence that the market revolution had on the average American family.